September 1945. The Pacific War had ended, but for the women behind the wire, the war was not yet over. Female Japanese POWs, nurses, auxiliaries, and camp followers, sat in quiet groups, their bodies still carrying the weight of fear, their faces hardened by weeks of hunger and shame. They had been told to expect cruelty. To surrender was dishonor. To survive as a prisoner was humiliation. And yet, in the American camps, they did not face the punishments their commanders had promised. Instead, they faced something else, something far more confusing. The sound of laughter. It drifted through the camp like sunlight breaking into a dark cellar. Children's laughter, clear, unbroken, startling in its freedom. At first, the women ignored it. They sat stiffly on the benches near the mess hall, avoiding each other's eyes. But the sound grew louder, peals of joy, shrieks of delight, bare feet pounding on dust. American children were running near the fence, playing games of tag and chase. The women stared, then looked away quickly, hiding their expressions behind their hands. Some began to laugh softly, not with joy, but with disbelief. Others shook their heads and whispered. "American children are foolish," one woman muttered. "Undisciplined." In Japan, children had been drilled with bamboo spears, taught to bow before the emperor, to prepare for death as easily as for life. But here, children laughed as if war had never existed. The contrast was unbearable. The POW women laughed back, quietly mocking them. Their giggles were edged with bitterness. "Look at them," another whispered. "Running free like animals. Not even afraid of prisoners." One small boy stopped his game. He pressed his face to the wire, wide-eyed, grinning at the women inside, his nose flattened against the steel mesh. The women turned away, hiding their smiles, whispering, "So rude. No respect." But the boy did not leave. He lifted his hand, a clumsy little salute. Some of the women laughed again, shaking their heads. Others clutched their sleeves tighter, unsure if it was mockery or play. For them, children were supposed to fear soldiers. In their world, war had stripped childhood away. Yet here, children laughed at uniforms, not in fear, but in curiosity. The women told themselves it was ridiculous, that these American children were spoiled, shameless. Yet in their laughter was a flicker of something else, envy. Because as they watched the children run and shout, they remembered their own families. Their little brothers back home, handed bamboo sticks instead of toys. Their cousins, drafted into the war before they became men. One woman, a nurse barely 20, covered her mouth as her shoulders shook. She was laughing too, but not at the children. She was laughing at the impossibility of it all. She did not know it yet, but the laughter was only the beginning. Soon those same children would call her something she had never expected to hear from the enemy's lips. Mother. The next afternoon, the children returned. Their games carried over the camp like birdsong, echoing against the barracks. The women sat together, watching with guarded curiosity. Some tried to ignore them, but their eyes kept drifting back. The boys raced in circles, their laughter sharp and wild, while the girls clapped and sang rhymes the women did not understand. Their clothes were patched, but clean, their hair tied in ribbons. They were ordinary American children, but to the women behind the fence, they seemed unreal. One prisoner, older than the rest, muttered bitterly, "They play while our children starve." The others nodded, their thoughts returning to villages across Japan where food was scarce, where mothers boiled tree bark to feed hungry mouths. And yet the sound of joy was irresistible. Against their will, some of the women began to smile. Others whispered sarcastic comments, laughing quietly, as if mocking the children's carefree world was the only way to protect their own pain. Then something unexpected happened. A little girl, no more than 8, approached the fence. She carried a red ball in her hands, its paint chipped, its leather scuffed. She pressed it against the wire and pushed it gently, as though offering it. The women recoiled. None dared touch it. They whispered frantically. Was it a trick? Was she mocking them? The girl only grinned, her teeth crooked, her eyes wide with sincerity. One of the American guards stepped forward, but instead of scolding the child, he simply shook his head and smiled. He let her stay. To him, it was harmless play. To the prisoners, it was shocking. Finally, one of the younger women, barely 18, reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing the rough leather through the fence. The little girl laughed, delighted, and pushed harder. The ball rolled beneath the wire, landing at the woman's feet. The women froze. The ball sat there like contraband, a bright piece of innocence in the dust of captivity. Slowly, the young woman picked it up, turning it in her hands as though it might explode. The prisoners laughed nervously, covering their mouths again. The child clapped, bouncing on her toes. Then she shouted something none of the women understood, pointing at the ball, then at herself. The gesture was clear enough. Throw it back. The women looked at each other, their laughter now mixed with disbelief. They want to play with us? One whispered. Impossible. But the girl's expectant face broke their resistance. The young woman tossed the ball weakly through the fence. The girl caught it, squealed with delight, and ran back to her friends. A game began, one that ignored barbed wire, uniforms, and war. The women laughed again, but this time it was different. Not mocking, not bitter. It was the laughter of a memory, of a time when they had been girls too, when play had not been stolen by war. And as the children cheered and clapped, the prisoners felt something they had not allowed themselves to feel in years. Hope. The game became a daily ritual. Each afternoon, the children would appear with their red ball, tossing it back and forth through the fence. The women laughed more freely now, their hands no longer covering their mouths. Their guards watched but did not interfere. At first, the prisoners mocked the children in whispers. Look at their clumsy throws, one giggled. Another added, their hands are soft. They've never worked in fields. But slowly the sarcasm softened. The women's laughter became genuine, almost childlike. One day, the little girl pressed her face against the wire again. She pointed at one of the women, a nurse with kind eyes and dark hair tied back in a scarf. Then, in a voice high and clear, she called out a single word. Mother. The sound froze the women. They exchanged glances, their laughter dying instantly. Surely they had misheard. Surely she hadn't said that. But the girl repeated it. Mother. She pointed again, beaming, her small hand clutching the wire, as if it were nothing more than a picket fence. The women's faces flushed. Some turned away in embarrassment, others whispered in disbelief. Why would she call us that? They were prisoners, enemies. Mothers belonged at home, not behind barbed wire. Yet the child persisted, calling each of them in turn, pressing the word into the silence like a gift. Mother. Mother, she chirped, laughing as if the name were a game. One woman finally laughed too, covering her face with both hands. Another shook her head, whispering, These children are strange. But inside, something shifted. For years, they had been told they were expendable. That surrender had stripped them of honor, that captivity had stolen their worth. Yet here was a child, an American child, who looked at them and saw not enemies, not prisoners, but mothers. The irony was piercing. Many of these women had left children of their own behind in Japan, children now starving, children they might never see again. And yet, across the fence, strangers called them by the very name they longed to hear. The young nurse pressed her hand to her chest, her laughter trembling on the edge of tears. She had been mocked, beaten, discarded during the war. But in that moment, a little girl had given her back something the war had stolen: her identity as a human, as a woman, as someone worthy of love. The guards looked on in silence. They, too, seemed moved by the exchange, though they said nothing. The word mother floated through the camp like music, disarming, disorienting, impossible to ignore. And as the children ran off, laughing, the women were left sitting in stunned silence. Their giggles had returned, yes, but softer now, tinged with something heavier. They had been called enemies, prisoners, dishonorable, but never had they expected to be called mothers. The following days brought more than laughter. The children, emboldened by the game at the fence, began to bring gifts. They were simple things: an apple shared from a lunch basket, a handful of wildflowers picked from a roadside ditch, a stick of chewing gum carefully split in two. The women stared at these offerings as though they were treasures. For months they had known only rations of thin soup and stale bread. Now a small hand slipped fruit through the wire, and they hesitated, unsure whether to accept. One woman finally reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the apple. She held it as though it were porcelain, then pressed it to her lips without biting. Tears welled in her eyes. The others whispered in astonishment. The children laughed, delighted by the reaction. To them it was nothing: an apple, a flower, a stick of gum. But to the prisoners it was proof of something unthinkable: kindness from the enemy. The nurse who had first been called Mother was given a daisy, its petals slightly crushed in the girl's small hand. She tucked it into her hair, and the women around her giggled, nudging her shoulders, whispering that she looked like a bride. She laughed too, but her laughter shook. The guards did not intervene. They watched silently, some even smiling. They knew the power of such gestures. Gifts had a way of piercing walls that weapons could not. One afternoon, a boy slipped a drawing under the fence, crayon on paper, a messy sketch of smiling stick figures holding hands. The women crowded around it, their faces softening. The child had drawn them, not as prisoners, but as family. Some of the women laughed until they cried. Others wept silently, clutching the paper to their chests. One whispered that she hadn't seen a child's drawing since her son had scribbled on their kitchen wall back in Japan. The irony deepened. These American children, strangers across the wire, were treating them not as enemies, but as mothers, sisters, aunts. The word mother returned again, shouted in playful voices, echoed by more and more children as they gathered near the camp each day. At first, the women resisted. They laughed as a defense, mocking the foolishness. But soon they could no longer hide what had stirred inside them. Each flower, each apple, each scrap of candy was more than a gift. It was recognition. They had expected scorn. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they were given respect, even affection. And it came not from soldiers, not from officers, but from children too young to understand the weight of war. That evening, as the sun sank and the children disappeared into the distance, the women sat in silence. The gifts lay in their laps, fragile but real. One of them whispered, "They do not see prisoners." Another answered softly, "They see mothers." And for the first time, the women began to wonder if they were seeing themselves differently, too. The children no longer stayed at the edge of the camp. By late September, they began to slip closer, pressing their faces and hands against the wire. Their laughter spilled into the compound like music, filling spaces that once echoed only with silence and shame. The women gathered each afternoon now, waiting for them. They told themselves they came only to watch, to laugh at the foolishness, to pass the time. But deep inside, they knew something else was drawing them to the fence. One boy, his hair sun-bleached and messy, reached through the wire one day. He stretched his fingers. wiggling them playfully toward the prisoners. The women gasped, instinctively pulling back. To touch an enemy was unthinkable, and yet slowly one woman extended her hand. Her fingers brushed his for just a moment, a fleeting contact, warm, human. The boy laughed with delight, as if it were a game. The woman snatched her hand back, covering her mouth, half laughing, half trembling. The others giggled nervously, whispering to each other, "These children are too bold." But their eyes lingered on the fence, on the small hands that reached through without fear. Soon more children pressed their palms against the wire. Some of the younger women touched them hesitantly, palm to palm, divided by steel but connected nonetheless. Their laughter was no longer mocking. It was soft, surprised, almost maternal. For years they had been told they were dishonored, worthless, tainted by surrender. But now little hands sought theirs out, unafraid. To the children they were not prisoners. They were people, warmth, comfort, safety. The word came again. "Mother!" shouted a girl, pressing both her hands against the wire. The women laughed, shaking their heads, but tears stung their eyes. To be called mother by a stranger's child was bewildering, yet it pierced deeper than any insult. One prisoner, older than the rest, whispered that she had left her own son in Nagasaki. She hadn't heard him call her mother in years. Her hands trembled as she touched the fence, as though she were reaching for him across oceans. The guards glanced at the scene but did nothing. Perhaps they understood the power in that moment. Perhaps they saw that something beyond captivity was happening here. By now, the laughter of the children had stopped being a curiosity. It had become a lifeline. Each day, their visits chipped away at the walls of fear and bitterness the war had built around the women's hearts. That night, the prisoners lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their barracks. Their hands still tingled from the touches, their minds replaying the sound of children's voices calling them mother. For the first time since captivity began, they felt something dangerously close to comfort. And comfort, they realized, was more unsettling than cruelty. Because it raised a question none dared ask out loud. Had they become more than prisoners in the eyes of their enemies' children? The next week brought something unexpected. The children no longer only tossed balls or passed flowers. They began to play games with the prisoners, teaching them through gestures and laughter. One boy drew a circle in the dirt with a stick, motioning for the women to throw small stones into it. At first, they shook their heads, embarrassed. They were prisoners, grown women, some mothers themselves. How could they play like children? But the boy kept grinning, tossing a stone himself, shouting in triumph when it landed. Finally, one young prisoner bent down, picked up a pebble, and threw it. The children clapped wildly, cheering as though she had won a battle. The women laughed, louder this time, less restrained. Soon more of them joined, tossing stones, giggling like schoolgirls, forgetting for a moment the fences around them. For years they had been told that discipline was strength, that laughter was foolishness, that joy was a weakness unfit for soldiers or auxiliaries. Yet here, across the wire, children shattered that belief with nothing more than games. One girl began teaching a clapping rhyme, pressing her palms against the fence, and chanting words in English. The prisoners did not understand the lyrics, but they mimicked the rhythm, laughing as they stumbled over the beats. It became contagious, waves of laughter rolling through the camp. Even the guards smiled, their stern faces softening as they watched enemies and children play together. The women began to realize something profound. The children were not mocking them. They were teaching them. Not words, not lessons from books, but the lost art of being human, without fear. One prisoner whispered, almost to herself, "They laugh at us, but not in cruelty. They laugh to bring us in. She covered her mouth quickly, ashamed of her own thought, but the truth of it lingered. The word mother came again, shouted between claps and chants. The women's eyes glistened as they heard it. Some turned away, afraid of what it stirred. Others allowed themselves to smile, even as tears streaked down their faces. For the first time since capture, they felt like more than bodies, more than soldiers, more than prisoners. To the children, they were mothers, sisters, family. And that recognition unraveled them in ways the barbed wire never could. That evening, the camp buzzed with whispers. The women replayed the games, the laughter, the word mother echoing in their minds. Some admitted quietly that they had not laughed like that since they themselves were children. Laughter had become dangerous in wartime Japan, seen as weakness, punished as disrespect. Yet here, laughter was survival, connection, even healing, and the women could no longer deny it. The American children were teaching them how to live again. A week later, the women noticed the children carrying something different. Not flowers, not toys, not food, but scraps of paper. Crumpled notebook sheets, torn from school books, folded carefully in small hands. The prisoners crowded near the fence as the children held them up, showing drawings of stick figures holding hands, hearts scrawled in the red crayon, and clumsy words written in English. The women tilted their heads, struggling to make sense of the symbols. One of them, who had learned a few English phrases from her brother before the war, squinted at the shaky letters. "We love you." Her breath caught. She whispered the words aloud in Japanese, and the other women gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. Could it be true? The enemy's children telling them, prisoners, outsiders, that they were loved? The guards did not intervene. They allowed the exchange, perhaps even encouraged it. Slowly, with trembling hands, the women reached through the fence to accept the letters. Some pressed them against their hearts, others kissed the crayon marks like sacred relics. One note simply read, in crooked English, "You are not bad." Another, "Be strong." And one, written in a child's careful hand, said, "I wish you were my mother." That last line broke the silence. A woman sobbed openly, clutching the paper as though it were her own child's voice speaking across oceans. She had lost her son in the firebombing of Tokyo, and here, through the wire, she felt him again. For others, the letters unlocked memories they had buried, bedtime stories whispered to children they might never see again, lullabies hummed in darkened rooms, the scent of rice cooking in homes now reduced to ash. The word mother echoed again, but this time not as playful chanting, but as something written, permanent, undeniable. It was not mockery. It was an offering. Some women could not hold the weight of it. They collapsed onto the dirt, clutching the notes, whispering prayers of thanks or apologies to children they had abandoned by force of war. That night, the women shared the papers among themselves, tracing the drawings with their fingertips, as though the ink were precious metal. For the first time in captivity, they slept with something under their pillows, not out of fear, but hope. One whispered into the dark, "If the children can forgive us, maybe the world can too." And though none dared to say it aloud, they all understood. The children had given them something neither soldiers nor treaties could ever provide, a second chance to believe in love. By the following week, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted. The guards, who had once kept their eyes stern and their rifles steady, began to notice the women smiling, sometimes faintly, sometimes shyly, after each afternoon visit from the children. It was subtle at first. A woman brushing her hair with more care, another humming quietly under her breath. One even stitched a small flower onto the corner of her prison-issue blouse using thread unraveled from a blanket. The guards exchanged puzzled looks. They were used to silence, fear, and suspicion, but now something softer was taking root behind the wire. They decided to observe without interference. When the children returned, their visits grew longer. A few sat cross-legged in the dust, pressing right against the fence, telling stories in English the women could not understand. Yet somehow tone and gesture carried meaning. The women listened intently, nodding, smiling, laughing at the children's exaggerated hand motions. They did not need translation. The language of play and innocence was universal. One afternoon, a guard overheard a little girl ask her mother on the other side of the camp fence, "Why are they sad?" The mother, unsure how to explain prisoners to a child, simply said, "Because the world forgot to love them." That answer clung to the women's ears. Forgotten. That was the word that fit best. Forgotten by their nation, forgotten by their commanders, forgotten by the war itself. And yet these children seemed determined to remember them. The guards, hardened men who had seen combat, felt their own walls crack. A few began quietly slipping extra bread or candy into the parcels left near the barracks, as though following the children's example. One German woman, pale and gaunt, stared at a chocolate bar handed through the fence. She shook her head, refusing. The guard simply shrugged and said, "Keep it." And the kids told us to. She froze, then laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. It was the laughter, more than anything, that stunned the guards. Laughter inside a POW camp, once unthinkable, now echoed against the barbed wire. It startled them, but it also softened them. The Americans had been trained to see these women as prisoners, as potential threats, as reminders of a brutal war. But watching them cradle drawings, press candy to their lips, and even dare to laugh, it became harder to see enemies. The women themselves felt it too. They began to look at the guards differently. Not as jailers, but as men. Men who carried letters home from their own children. Men who, like the women, had been pulled into a war neither side fully chose. That night, one prisoner whispered into the barracks, "Maybe we are not forgotten anymore." No one contradicted her. The afternoon sun hung heavy that day, casting long shadows across the fence line. A group of American children arrived carrying paper bags, each stuffed with something mysterious. The women watched curiously, exchanging whispers. The bags crinkled as the children set them down in the dust. One boy reached in and pulled out a ball, patched and worn but still full of life. He bounced it once, twice, then rolled it gently under the fence. The women hesitated. Was it a test? A trap? But then one of the younger girls among them, barely 18, reached out nervously and picked it up. The children clapped and cheered. The girl blushed, hugging the ball as if it were treasure. What happened next was something no one had expected. The boy motioned for her to throw it back. She did, awkwardly, her arm weak from malnutrition. The ball rolled short. But the children didn't laugh cruelly. They laughed joyfully, encouraging her to try again. Soon the fence itself became the boundary of a game. Back and forth the ball went, rolling under, tossed over, caught and missed, each mistake greeted not with scorn, but with laughter that filled the air. The women laughed too, at first softly, then louder until the sound was unmistakable. Laughter, real laughter. The kind they had once believed had been buried forever. One of the older women, who had not smiled since her capture, laughed so hard she wiped tears from her cheeks. She whispered, "I thought I would never feel this again." The guards leaned on their rifles, watching the bizarre scene unfold. War had turned laughter into a rare luxury, yet here it was, spilling freely across the barbed wire. The children began pulling more objects from their bags, small dolls, wooden cars, scraps of candy. They handed them through the fence as though it were Christmas. The women accepted each one with trembling hands. It was too much for some. A young mother among the prisoners held a doll, pressed it against her chest, and broke down sobbing. She had once cradled her own child back in Germany, before the war had swallowed everything. The children did not understand the depth of her grief, but they understood tears. One little girl reached through the fence and patted the woman's hand, whispering a word she could not understand. Mama. That single word pierced the silence like lightning. The other women gasped. Mama. A name they thought had been stolen from them, a role they thought they had lost forever, suddenly restored by a child's innocent lips. From that moment, the prisoners were no longer just captives. In the eyes of the children, they were women, they were mothers, they were human again. And in that realization came both laughter and tears, proof that even behind barbed wire, dignity could be reborn. That evening, long after the children had gone home, and the last echoes of laughter had faded,